Silver Eye Society.
Welcome to the Silver Eye Society, the podcast where we look at movies to find stories that can explain the eternal themes behind the modern issues we see in our culture today. So, whether it's nihilism, existentialism, tyranny, comedy, we look at it all. In this episode, we're looking at a classic. What is the name? I forgot.
A Nightmare on Elm Street.
There it is. That's it. Yes. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Famously, as I was going to call it, though it is not named this, Freddy Krueger. Krueger? I'm sorry. I just with the name, whatever, ignore it. Ignore that. Freddy Krueger is one of the famous villains of the 80s.
This is a movie podcast. It's called, this is the movie Freddy Krueger. Yeah. He is a villain of the ages.
Of the 80s. I said the 80s.
I thought you said a villain of the ages. I think he might qualify as a villain of the ages
well,
also.
If he's from the 80s, then he is also a villain of the ages at that point. I wasn't even alive in the 80s. See, I like this movie because to me, it's nostalgic. It's a novelty. You didn't like this movie. Why?
No, it's not that I didn't like the movie. I'm a little bit older than you, so I actually remember watching it when I was a youth. I was a youth in the 80s. Now, I didn't watch it in 1984 when this film came out. This film, A Nightmare on Elm Street, not the film Freddy Krueger. But yeah, there are good things about it. It's probably something that I see a little differently since I guess I didn't experience it first in a nostalgic way. Freddy Krueger was all the rage in my youth in the late 80s, early 90s. Everyone wanted to dress up like it's really kind of odd when you think about it, because I don't think the connect kind of hit the kids and their parents. They're like, hey, you're dressing up as a murdered pedo. That whole part, that part.
Yeah.
I don't think that really came through in the film a lot. They didn't really, because that would have really dampened the market for the Halloween costumes, I feel like. If it's like you're dressing up like a pedophile.
That was burned alive.
Yeah. It's not as cool then.
Well, that's why it's subtle, okay? They kept that aspect of his personality subtle. We've got a lot that we're going to get into with Freddy Krueger in this movie. Let me lay it out. Let me lay out the map of the terrain that we're going to cover with this movie. One of the things that struck me, and I added this last minute to our podcast outline, is the idea of whether evil transcends time. This is important to the concept behind Freddy Krueger. He's a human being, or he was, and then he was murdered in revenge, but then he came back for revenge. So he's able to attack people that are living through the dream realm. So it's this question of whether evil can actually transcend death. So we'll get into that. We're also going to talk just a little bit. Do you have a comment, Justin?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring a little bit more of the movie trivia into that one particular point, which is in the film Jaws 6. Jaws actually comes back. There's
a Jaws 6?
Yeah, Jaws defeated and killed, and then comes back as Ghost Jaws.
Are you joking?
I am.
Oh, God. Oh, okay. You never know with these movies, because there is like 1,000 Freddy Krueger movies, so you never know if they're going to bring them back like in the franchise as something insane.
There were some crossovers, I believe. They did the Jason and Freddy, I think, were in cahoots, we might say. I don't actually know. I didn't watch any of those. Yeah. I watched, the first one, the second one, the third one, probably the fourth one or something when I was younger. Yeah, I mean,
I've never seen any of them.
It was a blockbuster, really, really a huge film in the 80s, and the entire franchise, as they like to say, it was very, very popular and remains popular.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons it remains popular is why I like it, which is kind of, there's an element to something when it gets so old that it doesn't merge with its culture anymore, but it just becomes funny then. So this movie, there's actually some parts that are funny since they're so of their time or a little cliche or whatever. But there's also themes that are eternal. And that's what we do here at the Silver Eye. We look at the underlying themes that reappear throughout time and culture. And one of those themes is something that is in the news today quite often, and kind of always in the news in some different way, which is the whole point here. It's the idea of a threat that looms for your child and the necessity of protecting children and what happens when there is no one to protect children. So Freddy Krueger is famously a crazed pedophile of a character. And so you couldn't really conjure up any more of a threat for children if you're going to put a horror movie together. But we're going to look at this idea of the panic over children's safety and how this is a recurring theme both throughout art, where you see the kind of the horror villain that's coming after the kids, but also in culture, whether it's debates on kids listening to Led Zeppelin records backwards and getting satanic messages, or QAnon. We're going to go through it all. And to sum up, we'll lightly touch on, well, you'll touch on, Justin, why don't you introduce it?
We may, if we get to it, talk about a kind of overarching theme in horror movies, which is family dynamics that are either in flux, families that are broken, families and the relationships that are problems, which is at the root of almost every horror movie in existence. And if you think that I am wrong, no, you're wrong. And also, there is a difference between a horror movie and a monster movie. And this is something that maybe we'll talk about in future episodes. We won't get into it a lot tonight. But when the family is not there as the center, oftentimes what you're watching is a monster movie, not a horror movie. This is my speculation. I think everyone's speculating, everyone's wondering, everyone's terrified, everyone's horrified, everyone's upset about the fact that they have not gotten the word of the podcast yet.
Well, wait. I want to take a moment to thank one of our special listeners / watchers. I have to show this incredible coaster that we now have at the Silver Eye Society. This is so cool. And I want to thank the listener / watcher that made this. It's super awesome. And I immediately bragged to all of my friends and family about how awesome this is. So, Justin, you haven't received yours yet because I haven't sent it to you. I'm hoarding them both. Now, let's get right into the word of the podcast.
The word of the podcast for this episode is going to be bogey.
Oh my God. I love that word. I love that word. My dad likes to watch golf, and golf uses the word bogey, right? Why are you looking at me like that?
Because you spoiled the final act of the word of the podcast. Oh. Yes, because the first
but people
bogey.
Already know.
Just listen, let the word of the podcast take you away, sweep you away into a land of words and relaxation. Bogey. It shares ancestry with many dialect words for ghost, specter, such as boga. But mainly, do you see, this comes from the word, this is where we get the word boogeyman. Mm-hmm. You know that already? Okay, great. Yes. Great for you. Yeah, good. Okay. Spectre that haunts a gloomy spot. 1570, Westmoreland, Lancashire, Cheshire, Northern England, basically. Now, the earliest modern form appears to be Scottish. Again, a ghost. My point is, there's a point in the movie where they say, "Do you believe in the boogeyman?" And I thought, well, let's look at the word a little bit. All right. At the beginning, World War II aviator slang for unidentified aircraft, presumably hostile. Now, the second meaning, which is what I was going to talk about, was the golfing thing. Now, my question to you is, since you want to jump in on the word of the podcast and be such a integral part of the word of the podcast, why do you think that the term bogey is used in golf?
Well, my
You're such
understanding,
an expert.
I am not an expert on golf, but I have been exposed to golf culture. And my understanding of bogey is that, in the most general sense, you fucked up and the ball went somewhere it shouldn't have, and it is a bad shot. If that's what they do in golf, if they take shots when they hit the ball.
So, all of our audience who are fans of golfing, I think we'll issue our first public apology now. Do you want to go ahead and do that?
I would never apologize. Watch.
Okay. So in golf, originally, the number of strokes a good player is supposed to need for a given hole or course. Later, the score won over par. From the same source as bogey. Now, here's why. This is the fun of the Word of the Podcast. On the notion of a phantom opponent represented by the ground score. So look, I'm no golf expert either. In fact, I've never played real golf with people because that requires friends and skill and effort and wanting to go outside in the daylight, all of which I have a deficit of.
Night
but
golf.
I have actually done miniature golfing at night.
Miniature golfing is kind of for degenerates, I feel like.
Well, it is.
It's like something you do when you're under the influence.
And I was.
I
I was in an enclosed spot, miniature golfing years ago, smoking cigarettes, and the smoke was like, I literally remember a child in the background saying, "It hurts my eyes." So yes, that day I was the bogey. I was both the bogey and the boogeyman. Sins of my youth. I literally remember the kid saying, "My eyes hurt." Anyway, look, it's fucking adult miniature golf, Like, I can't be responsible for that.
That's true.
Anyway, so I thought that was a cool little etymology bit there. That the idea is, I think, and like I said, I actually don't know golf, but my understanding is, so it's like, there's this ghost opponent that is kind of the average or a good score, right? And so this word comes from the idea of this kind of theoretical phantom opponent that you're up against as an individual. I may have to publicly apologize as well, because that may not be right at all about golf. We don't use such terminology on the streets of miniature golf.
I don't know anything about golf, so I'm going to let that assertion lie unchallenged.
Well, I think that ends the Word of the Podcast, and now we can go ahead and start.
Moving on. So let's go. Let's go right into the last minute addition to this episode. So I was doing some research on the character of Freddy Krueger because I wanted to understand more what is the backstory, because we're just talking about Nightmare on Elm Street, which is the first in this franchise.
It's known as Freddy Krueger.
Stop. Do not mock me on my own podcast. The movie Freddy Krueger. Now, in this movie, you don't get much of a background on Freddy Krueger. He's just the villain that appears. And in the later movies, my understanding is that that's where you get a lot of the background from. Well, I'm going to clue you into the background now if you are not in desire of watching all of the Freddy Krueger franchise to find out. Yes, he was a child murderer, and I don't know if it's confirmed pedophile, but I'm pretty sure he was. Like, I'm pretty sure the lore includes that. Either way, he was killing kids, so that's no good. But important here. So he was born of, it's so brutal. He was born of gang rape of his mother, which was a nun in a mental institution, who accidentally got locked into the chamber where they kept the most insane patients. And so he was born of, it's kind of a weird argument, this idea that he's the conglomeration of all these insane maniacs. It's not really how biology works, but fine. And then he was abused by his father and mocked by the children at school, which is always a recipe for a villain. But he tries to have a normal life. He does eventually get a job, get married, and even have a child. But what are you in thought
I'm
of?
afraid that I must interrupt this broadcast for an emergency Silver Eye Society correction. And it pains me to do this. It pains me to have this be
gosh.
the original one. I just researched. I just looked up, is Freddy Krueger a pedophile? And we need to understand something because I have made some assertions that Freddy Krueger was indeed a pedophile.
Was he not?
The original script called for him being a pedophile. However, there was apparently a high-profile case going on in California at the time. And they realized rightly that they didn't want to make him a pedophile in the movie because that would be a little too dark. And so they changed him to only a child murderer, which is much better. And when you do watch just to be clear, we are watching the original movie, not any remakes.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently there's a remake of the original movie that was released in 2010. And against Wes Craven's wishes, in that remake, they either heavily imply or state outright that he was a pedophile.
Look, listen. We can argue all day about it, but he is, okay? Even in... I
don't think he is. I can't.
In the movie, though, there's still these things about his character in Nightmare on Elm Street that are very suggestive of sexuality towards his victims. So, you know the part where the phone turns into a mouth and he tries to make out with the teenage girl? Yes. So, I mean, the character, it's still suggestive of that. And it was in the original script. So, I mean, sure, you can leave it out. But they conceived of the character with that in mind. So, I mean, I think it's still pertinent. But either way, fine. We will no longer refer to him. We will no longer disparage Freddy Krueger as a pedophile. We will simply call him a child murderer.
Or alleged.
That's better.
Alleged. Freddy Krueger, alleged pedophile.
Okay. Now I see why the parents in the film just decided to get together and burn him alive. Because they're like, this guy is getting away with too much. So here's the thing. That's part of the movie, though. Okay, so whatever. Let's get to the point here. He goes through all this hardship, but he turns out to be still evil. He doesn't overcome the hardship, okay? There's this idea that he was born evil because of the gang rape from a bunch of like crazy maniac criminals. So that this idea of like the seed of evil, if you will. Now, the fact that he dies, he's murdered by the parents of the children that he has killed. That's why he has all the like disconfigured flesh, because he's burned alive by these parents that take vigilante justice on him since he doesn't get arrested by the legal system. He gets out on a technicality.
So I'm going to interrupt again. Apparently now I'm the advocate for Freddy Krueger, unfortunately. I have found myself, he has no other lawyers, and now I have to be the advocate for Freddy Krueger. But you said he's murdered by the parents of the victims, but we know that at least one parent, Nancy's mother, she didn't have a sibling that was killed by Freddy Krueger. She just got in on the mob violence. She was like, yeah, I want to kill this guy. Look, I'm not judging her. Maybe she was right to do that. But it wasn't like she specifically lost her own child to Freddy Krueger. True. She just went and was like, let's burn this person alive. A little, ease up on the booze, Nancy's mom. I think, let's put the vodka down. Now, granted, people will say, well, she started drinking after she murdered somebody. Sure, but maybe she was drinking before. Maybe she used vodka to light him on fire. No one really knows. But I just have to say, in Freddy's defense, he was murdered by at least one person that did not have direct harm from his misdeeds.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I take issue. We have this moral discussion of whether it's right to burn him alive, and publicly, we cannot say that you should take vigilante justice. But I mean, he murdered 20 kids in the movie. So it's like, at that point.
Allegedly. The legal system actually, according to the movie, he was judged for his crimes and he was found not guilty.
Well, Okay, let's
What if
leave
Freddy
the
Krueger
case.
is the victim? What if he's okay? Let's think about this for a
He's
second.
not acting like a victim.
Okay, well let me throw this out there to you. Okay, we're getting crazy.
Victim shaming Freddy
No,
Krueger?
let me think. Let's imagine a scenario in which I don't want to say you or me. Let's say a viewer.
No, don't
is
do that to our viewers.
Well, I mean, just pretend it's someone else.
A person.
Imagine a person is accused of the most terrible crime possible. I mean, really, child murder is right up there in like the most terrible crimes possible, right? But what if they were innocent? What if you were Freddy Krueger, and what if you had gone through all this turmoil, which you just told me about, all of this thing, but you I don't know his backstory. You researched this, but he gets a job. He has a family apparently. I don't know what happened to them, but
he murdered his wife.
Okay, well that's no good. That's a strike against him. In this scenario though, I'm imagining a person. What about an innocent person who's accused of such a crime? Now here's the big question, okay? Let's imagine you were accused falsely of a crime, and that then you were killed by a mob by being burnt alive for the crime you did not commit. I might come back from the dead and fuck some people up too. If that happened to me, you know what I'm saying? Now look, I'm not saying that's what Freddy Krueger did, and I'm also not endorsing the crimes of Freddy K. I'm really not. I don't want to do that on YouTube. I'm just saying let's expand our minds here. And if you were falsely accused of terrible things and then murdered, you may take vengeance also.
And I will leave you with the last word on that argument. As we move on to discuss whether evil can transcend time. Now, here's the interesting argument that I would like to make, okay? So, assuming that Freddy Krueger actually is as evil as he is depicted in the film from now on. He's able
Agreed.
Yes. He's able to transcend time, the time of his life. The time of his life. He's able.
What's that? 80s? Isn't there an 80s song? Yes. Do you want me to sing it or do you want to sing it? Because it goes perfectly well with the time period, right?
Oh my God. No, please.
Maybe. Well, are you sure? Because I'd really like to hear that song with a montage of Freddy Krueger, like doing Freddy Krueger things.
Oh wow, this podcast is something else. Truly, we do our best to provide quality information and entertainment to the viewers, and we do so. I'd say so myself. Anyway, look, I'm trying to make a brilliant point here. Here is the archetype of evil, and evil doesn't die, right? Isn't that the saying you always hear? Evil never dies. Maybe that's what we're seeing in this movie, actually. It makes the point, and how terrible, how horrible this idea that someone, a murderer, a monster, you can kill this person and still they can come for you because they can transcend their own mortality. Evil doesn't die. So what made me think about this was, okay, you have this idea that he's able to attack people through the dream realm. The lore goes that he made some pact with demons, and this allows him to continue on his evil purpose. And the demons are like, yeah, that works for us, so let's, we'll help you to do that. And so he's able to attack people through the dream realm. But what is the dream realm but the unconscious, the realm of the unconscious? So is the idea that here, evil, there can be something so evil that it lives on and can do harm through the unconscious. There can be a person so evil, so harmful, that harm doesn't die with them. And now you think of figures like Jeffrey Dahmer or Charles Manson, or of course Hitler or Stalin. And all of these figures have died. Now, granted, for the, dictators, they've done so much harm on such a massive scale during their life, it's pretty clear to see that they altered the course of the world. And we don't exactly know how. I mean, there's obviously what was done, but we don't know how that changes the course of how the world changes. There's so many different things that come together that we can't imagine what the world would have looked like if Nazi Germany never happened, if Stalin's brutality never happened. So that's when I think of Freddy Krueger as this argument that harm can actually transcend the person's life. If you become so rageful, so vengeful, because that's his whole motive, is coming back to take revenge against people because he had such a horrible life and was so mistreated. And so now it's this, he comes back after death to enact more harm. And that's such an interesting idea because in a way it's an argument for dealing with your resentment and your rage and taking it serious, because you might become Freddy Krueger. Or you might become Charles Manson. You know, like there's also the very small, like the smaller scale human things. I don't want to only make this argument that, oh, if you become Hitler. You know,
Right.
there's people.
Yeah, there's mini Manson.
There's scale.
You don't want to become a mini Manson. But no, to be serious about it, because it is serious, is that you don't have to be a notorious serial killer to still cause pain that is felt through generations.
Mm-hmm.
People do this all the time. And sometimes they do it on purpose, sometimes they do it on accident. So that wider point is valid, acceptable. How not to be Freddy Krueger is maybe an instructional video we can do at some point. But I think that we've covered in the past some ways in which to not be a terrible person potentially. There's an aspect to this dispelling evil in the proper way. So I think about time that I spent in Romania studying folklore, and Freddy Krueger, despite my earlier defense of the potential of his innocence, if we assume that he is guilty, is an evil person. Now, the system of law failed. It didn't put him away and keep society safe. So then a vigilante group got together and murdered him. You may say, good. And I get it. Good. I'm for it. But they murdered him in a fairly cruel way. No? So they burnt him alive while he was kind of homeless, living in because wasn't he like living in like a shack or something? It wasn't like a good space. It wasn't, it was or like near a boiler room or something, right? Or maybe that's where he did his crimes. Something. I mean,
part of the unhoused community.
Look,
that's a marginalized identity.
That's true.
Did they enact violence against a marginalized group?
Well, they did.
So it was a hate crime against Freddy Krueger. It's
actually
a hate crime.
In a way. Okay, so there's something to this, though, despite your tasteless jokes. There's something to this, which is, look, I mean, fuck, this is hard to say, but like, you got yourself a child murderer over here, right? His name is Freddy Krueger, and you're out for justice, and I get that. Part of what feeds the vengeance of this myth, of this person, is that they, to some degree, tortured him when they killed him by setting him on fire. So to bring this back to the idea of the stuff that I learned while I was in Romania studying folklore, and the folklore we'll call vampires, but we're actually something called strigoi and a different thing, but there's proper ways in which to dispel evil. There is ritualistic ways to do that. Now, I'm not suggesting that
they drive a stake through his heart instead.
Okay. So what I'm trying to get at is that part of the vengeance, the pact with the demons or whatever that you've read about that Freddy Krueger makes, partially maybe he wouldn't have done that if they had have just, killed him in a more humane way, I guess is the way I'm trying to say. Because isn't there the sense that the sheer violence of something like that somehow gives energy to the evil itself?
Yeah, exactly. there's something interesting about that idea of the proper way to dispel evil. And in a way, you can look at our legal system as a secular version of that ritual. There is a process through which we dispel evil. So if someone commits a heinous crime, there is a process that they still have to go through, just like everyone else. And to circumvent that ritual may be to kind of make your own pact with something unholy, to open the, and this is kind of like always the religious rhetoric of like opening the door to evil and things like that. And there's also this more simple psychological idea that doesn't it justify his rage? Doesn't it in a way justify his view that he's persecuted? Now, granted, he's a child murderer, so you can't really murder a bunch of kids and then be like, see, people are bad. They burned me alive. But I think there's this strange kind of almost woo-woo idea about, putting out, oh gosh, putting out bad energy.
No. But we actually do. Okay, so beyond your crystal therapy idea, what I'm trying to say is that, like, we do this now. It's not weird when we still have capital punishment in this country.
Yeah, that's true.
And we're extraordinarily, in theory at least, like, it is a process that is supposed to be done in a very certain way. I'm not saying this is how it works, but in other words, you don't just go like push a criminal off a cliff and like, there are proper ways of executing people, and it has to be done lawfully. And I'm no lawyer, but so we do believe in this now, even at the worst possible person that has been prosecuted in a court of law, went through all the appeals process, Now, side note, I actually don't like capital punishment because I don't believe in putting that much power in the hands of the state. Separate thing. A lot of people will be angry at me for saying that. It's fine. Maybe we do a pass for Freddy Krueger. But my point is that this isn't odd. The punishment is supposed to be performed in a certain way, in theory, to be the least cruel. Because if you don't do that, then you get this whole thing of, well, then are we much better? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I still, in my personal judgment, think it is better to kill the Freddy Krueger, even if you're going to do it with gasoline, than to have the Freddy Krueger kill the kids or whatever. But you're not actually preventing necessarily the potential Krueger murders of the future. It's more vengeance. And how you dispense vengeance and revenge, there is an art to that, and there is a morality and code around that. You're not supposed to do it in certain ways, and it is that which fuels the Krueger, his pact with demons.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's what I think we're trying to get at, what the logic behind that ritualization of punishment and dispensing evil or dispelling with evil is. And I think maybe the problem is that if you both use the same tools, it becomes hard to distinguish who's on the right side. So, I mean, again, it is hard to make this argument when the person being killed is Freddy Krueger, but it goes again to that idea of the risk that, what if you're wrong? So then you can end up with this situation where you're enacting incredibly cruel death upon someone and you turn out to be wrong. So then you become the monster, right? And then that's that recurring theme throughout time of, when you try to dispel a monster, don't become the monster in the process.
Well, so let's look at a pragmatic way also. You put a stake through a vampire's heart, or actually it's not a stake, but a piece of whatever. It doesn't matter the specifics. I'm not going to give away the specifics of vampire dispelling. But the reason you do that is because it works. So the vampire doesn't come back. Mm-hmm. You could do other things to the vampire, right? So on a pragmatic level, maybe you don't murder, torture Freddy Krueger in order to get rid of him, because regardless of the right or wrong of it, now he's coming back and haunting the dreams of the children, which, again, by the way, you made a claim at the beginning of this that I didn't like the movie. That's not the case. I didn't dislike the movie. There are some B movie aspects to this, which is like the idea of he killed 20 kids. It's like, okay, fuckhead. Seriously, like you let this guy kill 20 children before you caught him? Like seems like a relatively small town. I don't know. You know all the history of this movie, apparently. I don't know where it's set, but it didn't seem like it was in a metropolis. It seemed like it was in kind of a suburb. So it's like, that goes to one of the things that we were going to talk about, which is the ineptness of the parental generation in this film. So, because go ahead.
Yeah, let's get into that now. So let's dispense with evil, and let's move on to the panic over children and why that recurs both in movie but in real life. So to start, obviously people care about their kids. So there's the most basic, obvious analysis here, which is, well, what could be more scary than some monster, some person harming your child? Let's set the obvious analysis aside, and let's get into more of the nuance here. So I was thinking about this movie when I saw this, when I was still under the impression that he was a convicted pedophile and not merely an alleged pedophile. But one of the main things about Krueger is that he is a threat to children. He murdered children, and now he's trying to murder more children. So this idea of children at risk, I was seeing this and I was like, oh, what does this remind me of? And then you told me it's QAnon. It's the panic over, and the panic actually isn't in this film, but it's the idea of children being in danger by some malevolent force, some type of evil. Because QAnon, I don't know anything about it, but I know that they're like, it's not just like, oh, kids aren't safe. They think there's like a whole, isn't it a pedophile thing too?
I don't know.
Okay,
exactly,
let's not make claims about QAnon then.
Right, we would want to cast aspersions. I don't know. What I mainly know about it is from comedians that talk about it, in particular, Tim Dillon has talked about it a lot. And so what I know about QAnon is basically from a comedian talking about it and from a little bit of the Joe Rogan podcast. I think he interviewed that
guy that did a
someone who did a big, big HBO series. But I think in general we can say they have beliefs that there are people that are murdering children and maybe molesting them, and also maybe cannibalizing them or something. I don't know the specifics, but I mean. And obviously a lot of extraordinarily bizarre aspects to all. But that is one of the aspects from what I understand.
So
all the videos were banned. I was late to the QAnon conspiracy. I didn't get to actually I didn't get to watch any of the conspiracy theories because they were banned by the time. I know. Who knows?
That's the problem. Now we're going to make misinformation because we don't have the source to study.
Misinformation about misinformation. About misinformation.
That's great. Excellent culture. Anyway, so yeah, at the core of QAnon is one of that same at the core.
That sentence is going to be picked up by the Google algorithm, I'm pretty sure, and we're just going to be jettisoned. At the core of QAnon is the figure of Freddy Krueger.
Like, this video has been flagged for misinformation. This is dangerous.
So anyway, less specifically, there is a history of conspiracy theories going back to the 1980s satanic panic stuff of children being victimized by evil forces. Mm-hmm. And that has played out most recently in the QAnon conspiracy theories and a whole host of sub-theories.
If you go back even farther, isn't part of the lore around witches that they eat children? I believe there is some folklore around witches that they would eat children. I mean, what is the Hansel and Gretel story but a witch living in the forest that intends to eat children? So this, and again, of course, there's this element of like, well, yeah, what is more innocent than a child and what is more evil than victimizing a child? But what I want to talk about in light of this movie is how you see something different in Freddy Krueger, because you see the kind of modern situation that may contribute to an increasing fear around children, potentially. This is speculation. I don't know exactly the levels of fear around children throughout history, but you made the point that as our lives have shifted and both parents work, people spend a lot of time outside the home. There isn't generally how there was in the past, where people had multi-generations living at home, which could spend more time doing childcare. When both parents leave the home to work, ain't nobody at home unless it's a nanny that's not family, or they go to daycare, or they go to school, which many brilliant minds have made the argument that school, as we see it now, the public school and all that, for the most part, at least to some degree, especially for the earlier years of school, is a large part just child care. It's just a system by which your children are being cared for. Of course, they're providing good instruction during that time. But I mean, especially for the earlier years, they're not learning about the Constitution. So a large degree of kindergarten, first grade and all that, a lot of it is child care with, instruction and socialization put in. But again, why would you need that socialization? Historically, the child would be around siblings and at home with many other parental figures and guardians. So you see this in the movie. You see the divorced parents, you see the distant parents, and you see the school that is where harm takes place at one point. Freddy Krueger does come to get Nancy at school. So school isn't even a safe place, although it helps her to stay awake. That's one of the things, is that when they're at school, they're awake, and Freddy Krueger can come when they're asleep, but she falls asleep in the classroom. So we have this kind of dysfunctional, disintegrating family structure that leaves the children at the mercy of a predator. And go on with your point. You can expand on that idea a little bit about how that may contribute to this growing insecurity about who's got our kids. And we keep seeing that play out in culture throughout time, whether it's QAnon, whether it's the Satanic Panic, whether it's the school board and education discussions. All of that ties into that root fear about who has your kid.
Well, as we were discussing this a little bit last night in preparation for the episode, it's also about, it's not just about who has your kids, it's about why do they have your kids. Well, my generation, there's this phrase called latchkey kids. They had to make up a phrase for it because it was fairly new. The idea that divorce rates became higher, when I was a kid. Two parents often had to be in the workforce. These are all trends that were beginning, and playing out in the 70s, 80s. I mean, I'm not that old, but, in this general time frame and have continued on. So there are these issues that come up now, which, I don't think would have even they wouldn't have needed to be dealt with, because first off, we also have to remember, historically, I'm talking about historically, your kids would have been working like in a field or whatever, instead of in any type of school. Schooling, public schooling, I'm not trying to make some case that I think that it's bad or anything. It's actually a really great benefit, when it was started in the 1800s, and to educate people, to make people literate, to increase standards in all sorts of ways. On the other hand, you have to look at it as going hand in hand with this kind of, it's not that it's the cause of it. It's just that family structures are dissolving and have continued to. Some of you may say, great, that's a great idea. We don't like the nuclear family or whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm not talking about the morality, this or that of it. I don't care about that. I'm talking about the fact. There are more people without both a father and a mother in the house. There are people who have a father and mother, but they both have to work. There's less, there's less, I would argue that there's less connection. And so then you have to put your kid, I don't have kids, but I assume this is how it works. You have to entrust someone else with your kid. And in this case, it's the school and the state. Whenever that happens, I have this feeling that there's fear and maybe guilt and maybe a whole mixture of emotions between the parent and then the institution. And so now you have a lot of argument about who has the right to teach your kids what in public schools. And in the 80s, you had part of this satanic panic movement, which was the idea, a lot of it was related to childcare. So like kids that were in childcare, the accusations were that they were being abused in childcare. So again, look, you see this thing where the parents are having to take their kids, put them over into some sort of institution. Now, as far as I know, the vast majority, I mean, I'm sure there were cases of actual, misdeeds on the part of people throughout history or whatever. But my understanding is, in general, this was a big panic and like people imagining things. This gets fairly complicated because it goes into where they would interview the kids, and the kids were very. You can lead, when you're questioning someone, you can lead, especially children, into telling you whatever the story you want them to tell you by asking questions a certain way. Not even on purpose, but that's just how it happens. Because kids pick up on what the adults want to hear. And if they already know that, then they'll kind of tend to go along with those stories. But the broader point is that there is a problem. And the problem is, you have this tension between parents and institutions of all kinds. And then you seem to occasionally get this, I don't think it's just fear. I think there may be elements of guilt to it, that they don't have the time maybe they would like to spend with their children. And so they I don't know that it's natural to take like your 3 or 4 year old kid and put them in the trust of strangers, like back
like
in
7
prehistoric
hours too.
For a majority of the day.
Yeah.
So like, look, I know cultures and times are all different, but in a general way, if you lived in a small village or whatever, you may be entrusting your children to the care of other people, but it may be neighbors or extended family. Think about the American system again. We don't even have oftentimes that the thing that like you from having kind of roots in Cuba or whatever have more of an extended family,
Exactly.
where you could maybe put your child.
Different. So let me tell you a little bit about that. That is actually considered a little bit offensive in my culture. On the Hispanic side, my grandma was aghast at the idea of my mom putting me in daycare or anything like that. And I actually have a story of, I guess it wasn't abuse, but of not getting the kind of care that you would get from a family member. I think it was one of the daycares that when you're too young to learn anything. So it's like preschool kind of thing. And my mom said that she had this bad feeling and she just couldn't shake it. So she went to the school and just showed up. And she found me like crying in the playground, like just sitting there, like totally red faced, being ignored by the teacher or whatever, the caretaker. And so, I mean, there's a lot of kids there. So, it's not that, the person was evil per se, but here's something that I've always noticed. And it's the same for the care of anything. If it's not yours, you don't care for it at the same level. And that goes for dogs. That goes for kids. That goes for elderly, for your elderly family members. That's the same situation in nursing homes where you have people that are vulnerable and dependent and need care, but they're getting care from strangers. And there is also an issue with, I don't know how widespread it is, but there's definitely a concern that people have to deal with neglect or even abuse of elderly people in the care of those facilities. And it's the same thing for anything that is yours that you place in the care of someone that's not related or connected to you. There's just less ownership. You could maybe even extend that logic to property, right? There's that famous issue of, if it's not yours, you don't take care of it the same way for renting. And if it's your house, you usually put a lot of care into it. If you're renting it, it's transient. You don't take full ownership of it. You don't tend to take care of it just as well. And so it's a weird thing because, again, yeah, it's not a moral argument saying like women should be in the house taking care of kids, but we do have to contend with what it means when you have such a distinct shift in the patterns of child rearing, but just general family structures. So it goes both ways. It's like that same thing of that while we don't have the extended family living with us to take care of our kids, we also don't often take care of our extended family now either. So I mean, that but it is a cultural difference. There's a little bit of a cultural difference there. And because my grandma would always be the one to take care of me. And that's, I think after that incident too, my mom was just like, no, you'll take care of her until she has to start school. And so I'm not entirely sure what to attribute that difference to, because I imagine part of it is that in certain parts of Latin America, there's still a lot more of the traditional family structure where women stay home. So, and grandparents live at home. So that kind of family structure is still somewhat, well, it is still more popular in Latin America than United States for sure. And so that's something we have to contend with. And I think that, I don't know how much it's a guilt thing, because I think there is definitely, look, there was a period where we trusted these institutions a little more. Our trust as a population in these institutions, public school, whatever it is, has declined. I think that that's pretty fair to say. Now, there was a time when I think it was seen as a good thing to put your kids into school. People wanted to get their kids into school early too, because it meant they would get socialized. They would get, instruction, and they'd get into the education system earlier, give them an advantage. I personally know people that weren't able to get their kids in as early as they wanted to, and it was seen as a loss for the child. So that guilt thing, I'm not 100% sure how it is like universal. I'm sure there are some people that do feel that. So it's an aspect of that. But there's also, I think the really central part here is contending with, maybe that guilt is not even conscious though,
That's what I think. And look, this is speculation. Again, I'm not a parent, so I'm really out there speculating. And but that's what I do, so I'm going to do it anyway. What I would say is that, well, it really doesn't. It's a small point. One of the ways people contend with their guilt is by flipping it around. So in other words, you could say, well, I'm really disappointed that I didn't get my 3-year-old into, school. Are they? Or,
yeah.
Like if you say you're disappointed, then you reaffirm that it would have been a good thing that you had done that thing. I don't know. It's not, again, this is really, I don't mind speculating on a lot of things, but I am careful because I'm not a parent. Like I really don't know. It's not really what I want to do. I just can say, I think fairly certain, in a fairly certain way, is that the society has changed over the last 50 years. This isn't controversial. Things have broken down in terms of family structure in a lot of ways. And there's going to be there's going to be effects, good or bad. There's going to be effects for that.
Yeah.
And one of the effects is that link between the kid and the parent is more tenuous now. Meaning that then you must trust institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that then you will inevitably have, because institutions are not perfect, even if they're
yeah.
you'll have involvement, but you also have mistakes.
Yeah.
And then my guess is that with enough of that, and then it can snowball into a kind of panic and into a real problem. But anyway, look, I'm not going to write a parenting book anytime soon.
No. I think what's interesting is the intersection of the family structure and certain political ideologies, because I know that there is, I don't know how much it's true to Marxism as the doctrine itself, or whether it's specifically something that's more in the modern ilk. But I know that there was a little bit of an upset for a while when the Black Lives Matter organization, the actual organization, not like the movement or whatever, stated, I think it was on their website, they said very blankly that they believe in the deconstruction of the family unit, something to that effect. And my concern with that is that it ties in with this discussion nicely, because again, when you have the breakdown of the family unit, as the family becomes more involved with the external world, whether that is commerce or government in the form of public school or industry, then there becomes this intermediary within the family. And that becomes the state in many ways. And if your goal is a stronger state, a state that has more involvement in people's lives, would it not make sense then to break down the family structure so that the state becomes that much more involved in your family affairs? So now the state has a large say in how you raise your child. And I mean, if you go to look at like, China, you had the state involvement in family planning. You couldn't decide how many kids you wanted to have. That was the state's decision. So it's an interesting thing to consider, especially on the left, like this idea that the family is political. There's this idea of the family as having some kind of some involvement in that ideology. And I wonder about that, because then it means what do they see? What do they see in the family that warrants involvement like that?
Well, so it's fairly, I don't want to say simple, but let's talk in a general sense about, why are we talking about communism and Freddy Krueger? I'm not exactly sure. But briefly, okay. Yeah, the state needs the family out of the way, because the state is the lowest level of social organization that can defy the state. So
no, the state is the lowest level of social organization that can defy the state.
Sorry. The family is the low. So you can say, imagine the individual, and then the family is next, right? And then ever increasing hierarchies of organizations. The family is the second to last, essentially, besides the individual, organization which can defy the state. That's why in communist countries in the past, one of the most corrosive things to do was to get informants so you'd have people informing on their neighbors or even their own family members. So you need to, plus the family unit, the traditional family unit in, let's say, the Western world, is associated with a lot of traditional values. If your program is to change the values of a society and change the structure of that society, you must eliminate the source of those traditional values.
Yeah.
So this isn't a theory. This is real, that practitioners of Marxism, communism, I won't go so far to use the word socialism because that means so many different things to different people. But, the family unit is
an obstacle
to that. And this is, don't take it from me, listen to people that lived in Eastern Europe, that lived in the Soviet Union, that, as you rightly point out, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist government told you how many kids you could have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
By the way, fucked it up.
Well,
because now they have a huge demographic problem. So beyond whether or not you have the ethics or morality of thinking that's okay, and hey, I think the state does know what's right. Here's the thing. The state doesn't even always get it right, So anytime you want to say, hey, give it over to the state, give it over to some sort of utopian vision of the state, you got to remember you're assuming they're even correct in the first place.
Yeah, and there's always unintended consequences to those kinds of central planning. But there's something uniquely devious in the idea of governmental involvement in family planning. Central planning for families seems incredibly dystopian. This idea that the state would mandate how many children someone could have. And of course, there's the argument, they're curbing overpopulation, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So it's an important thing to face our problems so we don't become Freddy Krueger. And I think we'll wrap it up there.
Well, let's say in Freddy Krueger's final defense,
oh my God,
we've accused him of being a pedophile, which may or may not be the case.
He was killing kids. He was a communist. He was trying to break down the family structure. Oh my God. Freddy Krueger, the movie, is anti-communist art.
Ronald Reagan most likely wrote it in 1984. Ghost wrote the movie Freddy Krueger, and this was a big metaphor, big analogy
for the dangers of trying to
communism.
Centrally plan family. What if Freddy Krueger was trying to enact a two-child law? What if that was his thing? What if he was saying, this is what overpopulation is a problem. I'm going to centrally plan these families.
Well, I think it was a one child policy in China.
Well, I think he had a zero policy child in that neighborhood.
Zero policy child. Zero policy child is a good name for something. That should be the name of the episode. Zero policy child.